I went in there and I came out of the gate with my Dubjonsky, which was, Judge, nothing in this case makes any sense except in the light of mental health. And all of a sudden, Judge is leaning in, everybody's waiting, and laid an ABT out there. And the judge wholeheartedly agreed, basically slapped the prosecutor down, and my client walked out of the courtroom that day.
Welcome, everybody, to the ABT Time podcast. This would be the 35th episode, and if you're watching this on YouTube, you can see what I'm holding up, which is 4 different versions of the book, The Narrative Gym. This is going to be the focus of today's session. This is an amazing, unusual episode in which we're going to have all 3 of the co-authors that have written these 4 books with me as our guests. And before we get into that, a little bit of setup here on different things. Starting with, we're at a major milestone in the history of the ABT. It'll be interesting to listen to this episode a year from now, because this Friday, we will finish the 25th round of the ABT Framework Course. In the 2 years since we started this on April 20th in the year 2020, we have gone through the course 24 times as just the more science-oriented ABT Framework Course, and then we did 1 round for the business community with Howell. So a grand total of 25 times through the course. We've probably produced about 750 or so graduates from it. I've done over 500 ABT builds at least, and it's just laid down a whole foundation of people that have gotten it on the ABT framework and these books that we're going to talk about. And what it means is that we're at this transition point, which is wonderful. As my good friend Matt, who's worked with me on every one of these sessions for the 2 years, likes to put it, this is about the arouse and fulfill. We are done with the arouse part. We have trained up a bunch of people in the basics of the ABT framework. The course itself is the arouse element that gets you interested and intrigued in this thing. Now it's time to start the fulfill part of the journey. And that is going to take place in the form of something we're going to launch at the beginning of May. We just came up with this in the last couple of weeks, and we've begun to shape this idea. It's going to be, roughly speaking, may get tweaked a bit between now and then, 6 weeks. But basically, it's going to be a weekly event on Wednesday mornings at 11 Pacific time for an hour. It will consist of 2 half hours, each of which will be like our working circles events. And they will feature, I'll be the moderator. One person will be the host, who will be presenting a 3-minute presentation at the beginning, a 3-minute talk they can have up to 3 slides. And then joining us will be what we call the analysts. These are all graduates of the course. They will then go through 5 questions that they will discuss with the host in terms of the presentation they just heard. And these 5 questions are basically, right now, we're still drafting them, but I think they're going to be along the lines of, number 1, what's the problem? Number 2, what's the ordinary world? Number 3, what's at stake? Number 4, what's the overall, what's the conversational ABT? Number 5, what's the Dubjonsky? And so it will be then those analysts, which there will be 4 partner groups each month that will join in, and they will have all of their graduates will make up the analyst group. It'll be probably somewhere around 15, 20, maybe 30, 40, 50, who knows? Well, we got to figure out what the optimum number is, but they will generate the discussion just like an ABT build for 25 minutes. I'll call on some of them live to be talking, and then others will be putting their comments into the chat window. And then the most interesting and important element of it is that there will be an outer circle that we'll put it on YouTube live where everybody can watch. And so this will be the first chance for the outer world to get to see the ABT framework in action. And they can actually watch these half-hour sessions of all these, quote, analysts, all the people that are trained in the framework, going to work on one person's narrative, helping them strengthen it using these basic tools. When you start to digest that, you will see what I've seen in the last 24 hours. I've run it by about 5 or 6 of our contacts, the different groups, and all of them instantly bought in and said, yes, we want to be one of the partners. Each month, there will be 4 partner groups, and they will provide 2 of the hosts for, total of, we'll have 4 weeks each month, and there'll be 2 people presenting each week. And so it'll be a chance for basically like an arena, as David Pullen yesterday said. We talked to him in the UK, and he just flipped over it, he and Sarah Jane. And he said, I view this as being like the operating room, in the old days where they had all the doctors in the seats, the stadium setting around the operating room, watching what's going on down there. That outer circle will be the outer world that it'll be wide open to view. And then we'll have our analysts there in the center. They'll be working on that one ABT. So that's the way to picture it. I think we'll come up with some artwork to match that. But I present all that right now because that helps set the stage for, we're going to call that event the Narrative Gym. And the reason it's so important is this is now the fulfillment of this idea that we've been preaching for 10 years, which is you cannot learn this narrative stuff in a one afternoon workshop or a 1 day or 1 week or even a 1 month. Even the 10 sessions that we do, the 10 1 hours, that's not enough. You've got to commit yourself to week after week after week, just a weekly maintenance thing. And that's what this will be. It'll be a chance for people to tune in for an hour and activate the narrative part of their brain as they're listening to the ABT being worked on. They'll be thinking to themselves, how would I do the conversational ABT on that? You can play at home, write it down on a piece of paper. And at the core of all of this is this foundation of these 4 books that really kind of give it the mouthpiece to some extent. These embody the other disciplines that we'll be bringing in, particularly from the business world. We'll have graduates from the business course taking part in this, and Park and David Pullen and other folks like that. And for everybody you're trying to explain it to, how the ABT works, this will be the core philosophy of this thing is going to be the age-old catchphrase of don't tell us, show us. We've all spent years now telling people about this ABT thing's amazing. This will finally be a chance for strangers to come and watch it in action once a week. And they'll see those moments where somebody comes up with a great suggestion, and they'll see the constructive analytical way that these tools work in this ABT build process. So that's all we're very excited about. And as a result, it's the perfect time right now then to pull together the 3 co-authors. And got to begin with apologies to everybody. This is going to be a meeting of the Older White Males Club. All 4 of us fall into the same demographic, with Doug being the youngest and maybe not quite there into the older white male crowd. But that's who we are. In the course, we've got lots of women and folks of different ethnicities and things like that. But for these books, this is how it turned out to be, the people that came along. And in fact, the history of these 4 books coming around in a nutshell was, I did the first one, the Narrative Gym, at the end of 2020. After we'd been doing the course, we developed this 3-step model that has become the core of everything. So I felt it was time for a short book, something along the lines of Strunk and White that sits on your desktop. It's only like 70 or so pages, 15,000 words or so. Then Park Howell, our business guy, who's been a part of the course from the very beginning, looked at the book, said, nice book, but my business people aren't going to buy it unless we put business on the cover. So I said, great idea. Let's do a rewrite of the first and last chapters, putting this content into the world of business. And next thing you know, last September, we produced this one, the Narrative Gym for Business. You can see on the cover there, it says for business. No sooner we get done with that than Doug Passon, lawyer who had been on Park's podcast and was really excited about the ABT, asked Doug, is there any chance he could co-author something with us? And yes, same formula. Let's do the same thing. Let's put law on the cover and let's rewrite the first and last chapters to put it into the world of law. That's basically what we did with that one. And then I managed to talk my good friend, Dave Gold, who is one of my heroes in the world of communications, veteran Democratic Party strategist, into joining me for the same thing for the world of politics. And notice on the cover of his, we put this Christmas tree here, the only unusual piece of artwork that differs from the others. And we'll talk about that. So those are our 3 co-authors. And, why don't we just jump into this? I'll say a word or two of introduction for each, but I think we don't want to eat up a whole bunch of time with bios. Park is longtime veteran of business and advertising world, who was a professor at Arizona State University, working in their Institute of Sustainability, and then started his podcast, The Business of Story, that's become hugely popular. In fact, Park will give us a few of the details on where he is with that. Doug Passon is a defense lawyer who will tell us in a few words about his history, how he had a lifelong interest in filmmaking and eventually managed to merge that with his law practice and began producing what are called sentencing mitigation videos that are so important that the New York Times written him up a couple times, and the Simpsons ended up using him as inspiration for an episode they did about mitigation videos that he hopefully will tell us a bit about that. And then Dave Gold is longtime veteran Democratic Party strategist who I got introduced to in 2017. In February 2017, he published a brilliant article in Politico, which you can find just by searching. We'll put it on the website there, but just search Dave Gold Politico and it'll take you right to it. And it was about the power and importance of narrative and the failure to take advantage of by the Democratic Party, and that accounting for a lot of their shortcomings. That article is so powerful and effective. We use it endlessly in the training in the ABT Framework Course. And so I managed to talk him into joining us in this effort with these books. So on that note, how about if all three of you activate your microphones and cameras, and we will begin this discussion. And hello, Doug, Dave, and Park. Let's see. How about each of you give us a couple sentences where you're coming to us from. Park, how are you doing? Where are you?
I am doing great. I'm up here in northern Arizona, about 20 minutes south of Flagstaff, up in the cool pines with crappy third world DSL. So it's great to be seen, at least.
Nice. Okay. Doug, checking in for us from somewhere more urban in Arizona.
Just 2 hours south of Park in Scottsdale, Arizona, where it is like a lovely 76 degrees and everything is sunny and the orange blossoms are in the air.
And Dave, you are also in the Southwest. Is that correct?
That is correct. I am in Valdez, New Mexico, in Taos County. And my wife, in fact, just got back from skiing up at Taos Ski Valley.
Wonderful. Okay. We're going to begin with origin stories. And I ask each of you to give us, just a brief little overview on how you first got introduced to the ABT framework, the ABT template, and if possible, kind of the one moment where it really hit you. That both Doug and Dave used the term game changer in their descriptions of the start of their books about their getting involved with it. So let's start with Park. Tell us how you got into it and when's the one moment where you really felt like it changed the game for you.
Yeah. When you introduced me, you had mentioned about my work at ASU, which is just really kind of a blip in my overall career. I really, for 35 plus years, have been in the branding marketing world and ran my own ad agency in Phoenix for 20 of those years called Park & Co. My main expertise has always really been about branding, making a complex brand story simple so customers can digest it. In 2013, I guess, Randy, you were coming out with your second book, Connection. And you guys sent me a pre-published version of it to read through and take a look at it. You and I did not know each other, but I found it interesting, your background. And as I was reading through it, I saw the ABT in it, which was not the main emphasis of that book either. But that was the moment when I read through the ABT and then how you teach it from my branding brain. I'm like, holy crap. Is this what I've been looking for my whole life? Some simpler, easier way to make that very complex messaging, well, simple. And so then that was the moment that really, as I was flipping through those pages I'd printed out from the PDF you sent me. And then you and I kind of became fast friends around the ABT and have sort of worked together. As you have brought it out to the science and academic world, I've been doing the translation into the business world and have just absolutely loved that evolution ever since.
When's the first moment you can think of where you actually used it and saw an impact, not on you, but on somebody else?
Well, the first time it really impacted me is when I was a little bit skeptical, because I thought maybe I'm just drinking the juice. Does this thing really work? And then I found the Gettysburg Address, and I'm like, oh my goodness, there it is. Where else has it been? So it first had the impact on me when I started looking where it has been popping up in life. And I don't know if I can point to an exact time with a customer other than I started using it, not very well, I might add. I had to practice. And I remember going down some blind alleys with it and calling you and getting your input on, all right, what am I doing wrong here? Because I get it, but I don't got it. what do I do next? And I can't point to, it was probably one of our students in the executive master's program at ASU when I was helping them with messaging around their sustainability initiative. And this woman is Karen from Cummins Diesel, now that I think back on that. And it was a time when she was just completely flustered in how to begin this presentation to her leadership on some sustainability initiatives she wanted to do out of Cummins. And that was after I had worked with you for a few weeks to really figure this thing out. And we applied it in that presentation. And she went, "Oh, wow, that's great." And I went, "Holy shit, that's really good." It even surprised me. That was the first time. I've never been asked that question, so I had to go do some digging with that. But I remember that distinctly now.
Well, and you know what? To that very point, you just passed the story test that you and I are always talking about. Yeah. Park's always telling me he has guests on his podcast, the Business of Story, and they really ought to be able to tell one good story to start with. And sometimes they'll just talk on and on about stories. So important. And like, can you tell us a story that really illustrates it for us? You just met that criteria right there. Told us one good story to get started. Thank you very much for that. And one other little tidbit I'm gonna throw in there. You made me think of for a moment about our buddy, Rick Nelson, who's been a long time part of the course, and this fish and wildlife guy from North Dakota. And he loves to tell the story about the day that he loves the ABT. And he called me up one day and said, "Randy, I've been trying to get this ABT straight and I can't get it to work." And then I said, "That's because you're doing it wrong." And what he loves to say is, I thought to myself, "Oh my God, I've upset Yoda." And I said, "You're doing it wrong because you need to have other people involved. You can't sit there by yourself crafting narrative and do a good job. This is why we've got the working circles. This is why we're going to launch the fulfillment of the narrative gym concept, which is going to be this mass event of having, I guarantee you we'll have 100 or 200 people very quickly on this thing, because we've got so many graduates in this Google group, about 300 people or so, that will instantly be turning up for it. But that's it. Narrative needs to be crafted in a social dynamic. It doesn't work so well if you're just by yourself, as all people that work in writers groups know in Hollywood. And that's where a lot of the stuff is deriving from, what we've learned in Hollywood. Doug, same challenge to you. Tell us how you heard about it first, and then that first kind of moment, especially a moment with working with somebody else using it. Take it away.
Okay, so connections are everything. So I'm a 25-year defense lawyer, but I've also been a lifelong lover of story, and I've been making little short films since I was in high school, and back when we had VCRs in the 80s. And I went to law school, but really early on I figured out that's all we're doing as lawyers is we're storytelling, and the side with the truest and most compelling story is usually going to win. And pretty soon into my practice, I figured out I was going to get to make movies for the law as well, because I started making these short documentaries for cases. And I think Park got wind. The New York Times did this big piece, not the most flattering piece, but that's another podcast. But anyway, they profiled my work, and somehow Park got a hold of it, and he invited me onto his podcast, and we had a great discussion. And I didn't know Park and his podcast at that point, but I started digging into it, and I'm like, ooh, Robert McKee. I love Robert McKee. And, like all this stuff that I've been gobbling up over the years of story stuff. And I'm not a business guy, but I was just loving every minute of it. And then, of course, I come across Randy Olson on the podcast talking about this thing called the ABT, and it really was like a ton of bricks fell out of the sky and just buried me, or the heavens opened up and the lightning bolt just zapped me and burnt me to a crisp. But the
got any more visuals for us?
I could keep going.
Do you have a positive one in there anywhere?
Yeah. Like a Mack truck ran over me.
I was overcome with ecstasy and joy, and so much so I wet my pants. And so I said, I've been teaching because I've been the story guy in my world, especially in the federal criminal practice, and I've been teaching lawyers for years all over the country story structure, story basics, and swimming in very deep waters of the hero's journey and all this stuff. And I knew that I was having a lot of fun. It may be entertaining, but at the end of the day, I wasn't giving my audience a whole lot to work with after an hour. They're not going to be able to take anything I said and do anything with it. And the moment I heard you talking about the ABT and how elegant it was and simple and actionable it was, I said, this is what I've been waiting for the whole time. And so I started digging deep into it, reading your books, starting to work those into my cases, and then, writing the book with you. So it's been fun being under your wing for these last year or so.
And how about applying it with anybody? Have you had an opportunity to?
I'm slowly, well, first of all, I apply to every single case I ever do, and it's completely changed the way I do it. And now I help, part of my practice, my business is helping other lawyers craft the story of their case. So it's ubiquitous now in everything I do. But I'll tell you one quick story of the first time that it worked for me like gangbusters. And it was one of these impossible odds situations where I was going into a hearing where my client had repeatedly violated the orders of the court. And it's a very strict judge. And the judge had given him a lot of chances. And the prosecutor was ready to throw the book at this guy. And I had every reason to believe the judge was going to hammer this guy too. And I went in there and I came out of the gate with my Dubjonsky, which was, Judge, nothing in this case makes any sense except in the light of mental health. And all of a sudden, Judge is leaning in, everybody's waiting, and laid an ABT out there to say, we are in the federal system. We pride ourselves on trying to get people the help that we need. And my client has a host of mental health issues, and those issues are connected to his behavior, but we have so far not offered him any treatment at all. And so if we are to expect a different result, then we have to give him the opportunity for meaningful treatment. And the judge wholeheartedly agreed, basically slapped the prosecutor down, and my client walked out of the courtroom that day and he's in treatment right now, and he's doing great. And I was like, okay, didn't expect that, but all right, this is real. But it was true. It's not like, criminal defense lawyer pulling some trick, magic. It's the truth. And you go in there and you tell a true, powerful story, and you're going to win the day.
Yeah. No, that's incredibly powerful. That makes me think of Patty Limerick, who told the story a number of times to our group about the keynote address she gave at a history meeting. And the first time she ever did an experiment with the ABT, in her first slide, she wrote the whole thing up there, and there were like 300 people there, these historians. And she just read, it was about the progressive era. And she read the ABT off the slide and turned around, and there was 300 people all staring at her like, we got it. Are we done here? We got your entire message all in one slide. And she'd never had that experience. So, bit by bit, we have this whole, eventually someday we'll pull together a compendium of testimonials of people with those individual moments that are they're that powerful. Okay. Now, third, Dave, I'm going to say a few more words of setup for you, because the way you came about my meeting you was way back in 2016. I've told about how during that year, I got to know James Carville and tried to work with him for about 3 or 4 months to try and get the Hillary Clinton campaign to listen to what we had with the ABT, and the fact that everybody in the media was saying she had no narrative, she had no message, and there she was running a campaign, and the ABT could have helped focus with that. And in the end, no one was able to listen. We got nowhere. And I've had years and years of dealing with this, is that you deal with these people who, you've got a combination of two things. Number one, they're so busy, they can't stop to listen to anything. Number two, they just don't have much narrative intuition to begin with. And so you're pitching this out there and it's just kind of clanking like, well, I don't even understand why that's important or relevant. So I got to the point where I was used to throwing stuff out there to people and having no response at all. Dave published his article in Politico in February 2017, like 3 months after the election, kind of in the aftermath of it all. And he was busy with all the responses on that. But one of Carville's contacts in DC ended up introducing me to Dave and sending him a few things about the ABT. And then I sent stuff to Dave, and then just thought, well, it's another one of these things. I'll never hear from this guy. And lo and behold, he got back in touch and said, this is really interesting. Tell me more about this ABT. And then we started, I think we had a couple of long conversations. He was working then, I think, with the DCCC. And so, Dave, that's a whole setup for you. You want to take it from there and tell us your side of that?
Happy to do so. I had been, for literally decades, trying to persuade clients, fellow consultants, campaign and committee staff of the need to tell stories. I had, much as Doug had suggested, spent years in the weeds of Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey, of lengthy treatises on script writing and other such books, and had never come up with a quick, easy, simple way of crafting a narrative. It was easy enough to say, well, you need real people telling real stories, and you need to tell your own personal story. But that's short of being a real effective narrative. And then you called, Randy, and presented me. It was as though the skies had opened and I was struck with a lightning bolt.
Keep them coming.
And I fall off a cliff and drown in the deep waters of the ABT.
Precisely. And I'm saying this is what I've been spending the last almost 3 decades looking for: a simple, easy way to shape a draft of a text into a compelling story. The first time it made a real difference for me was with my partners in our firm, as I was enthusiastically telling them about it. And it was for them too, a light bulb going off. It's more than simply finding real people to be validators and telling the campaign story, which, if you can have a campaign that has any idea of a story, it's a rare one in my party's politics, because as James Carville's former partner, Paul Begala, told me after he actually read the book, that he said he loved the book, and it makes an important contribution to our profession, but Democrats love programmatic lists, not compelling narratives built on tension and resolution, which showed me he actually had read the book. And that remains a struggle. But with the ABT, I've now had a couple of campaigns that have listened to that. And as we craft our mail pieces, because what I do specifically is direct persuasion, direct mail, as a component of a campaign's paid communications, we apply the ABT, looking at every draft of every piece and looking at how we can make it more compelling by applying this tool, a simple tool. It seems intuitive. It wasn't, because it took me, you teaching me it to me, Randy, after 3 decades of looking for how do I persuade people that there is a way to simply craft narrative. Now, if you have somebody who wants to put out 500 bullet point position papers and thinks that's telling a story, and they're elected officials and they know how to tell a story, you're not going to get very far, even with the ABT, unless somebody is actually persuadable that telling an interesting story is an effective
Okay,
way.
I'm going to, at this moment, officially coin a new term, the Begala Challenge. Matt, make a note of this. The Begala Challenge is the idea of converting Democrats from the, what'd you call it, programmatic lists to actual narrative.
Programmatic bullet point lists, position papers,
Yes.
that are nothing but programmatic bullet
Yep.
points,
Yep.
message memos that are nothing but bullet points of the best testing poll questions, no thought given to how they tie together
You know what, we're going after that because, and I am the eternal optimist. All this stuff. My older brother calls me the Sisyphean moron or something like that can't seem to figure out why that boulder keeps rolling back over to me. But it's parallel to what you've laid out there is what I've already dealt with to some extent in the science world, and not that we've made major progress, but the fact is with so many scientists, when I gave the TED Med talk in 2013 at their big TED Med conference, and lots of people came up to me that day, and they weren't so much intrigued by the ABT, they were more taken by the and template. And they said, no one's ever told me there was anything wrong with that. You know, I've had a whole career giving these talks of and I thought it was good enough to just get up there and put a list of information. And you're the first person to say that's not the right way to do it. There's a better way. An awful lot of these people have never had anybody come along and point it out to them that what you're doing is suboptimal and make the case to them. And the number of scientists that the process for them has started not with seeing the light of the ABT, but seeing the realization of the and then starting to think, okay, this guy said something's wrong with that. Let's start looking at what this ABT thing is. And I wonder if there aren't some of those Democrats that if only someone would come along and tell them what you're doing is not good enough, because the vast majority of these people, and by the way, I'm going to get into this in a few minutes, but when you get to the higher levels of the science world, you find all of these highly accomplished scientists with very high level positions who are terrible communicators, who no one has ever pointed out to them that you're just anding all day long. And yeah, your scientific findings have given you all these promotions. You're now at the top of the heap, but just because you're up there doesn't mean you're a good communicator. And you really are, and most of them are pretty dang hopeless. But let me just read the quote from Paul Begala on the back of our Narrative Gym for Politics book. He said, "When I was a starving student at the University of Texas, Dave Gold hired me to write copy. He taught me how to communicate with clarity, power, and emotion. From those days till now, he has been someone I look to for message guidance. In this book, he shares with the world those insights and a new tool to draw on the power of narrative structure. Consider yourself lucky. It took me decades to get these lessons from Dave. You can get them today." Tell us a little bit about your collaboration and friendship with Paul Begala over the years.
Well, I go back with Paul and James.
James Carville,
his former partner, to a 1984 U.S. Senate campaign in Texas. And Lloyd Doggett, state senator, was running. He won the nomination in a huge upset, lost the general election. Texas had already shifted, and it was not the last time a Democrat won statewide. That was Bob Bullock and Ann Richards subsequently, but it was already moving. But I went down to Austin more than once, working with the campaign, and fell in love then with Austin, and worked closely with Paul on the campaign, and decided I had come to hate Washington, D.C., a feeling that has only grown ever since. And so I just picked up and left D.C. and moved to Austin, and hired Paul. One of the first things I did when I got there, and to write copy, and lived there for 20 years, where I subsequently fell in love with my bride, and we married, and have now been living in the mountains of northern New Mexico for 17 years.
Wow. Correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't Ann Richards have pretty strong narrative intuition?
Oh, she was a rare candidate who did. She could tell a story,
yes,
and weave together disparate elements into a compelling narrative. She was the best.
Oh yeah, it just makes you ache for the past when there were politicians like that. Did you spend a lot of time around her during those years?
I did have opportunities to get to know her pretty well.
What was her famous line about George Bush was born with a, what was it?
He can't help it. He was born with a silver foot in his mouth. And then he was born on third base and thought he hit a triple.
Oh, gee, many Christmas. Yeah, no, she was tremendous. All right. So now let me dive into something that we'll all have things to say about. And this is just a big Oy Gavalt type of scenario. This is what I'm in the thick of for the past week. So, for the past 2 years, I've been trying to work with some top epidemiologists and about the communication of around the pandemic. And as we know, the pandemic, we're kind of at a point now where it's been 2 solid years and this surge is backed off. So you can almost draw a line of this was the first 2 years of the pandemic. Let's hope it's the last 2 years, whatever. But it began in chaos and it ended in chaos. It began with Trump as the president, with Fauci, who should have been the voice of authority, independent from the administration, but instead being co-opted and put up on the stage with him being forced to nod along with all kinds of nonsense. And you would have hoped that when the administration switched and Biden came into office, that overnight everything would have been cured and suddenly we would have had brilliance. And yet there's lots of articles being written now that are just basically saying that the poor communication was just as bad in the second year with the Biden team that came in. And so I've been working with a couple of top epidemiologists on the possibility of writing an article about this, editorial or something along those lines. And last week, I boiled my whole statement down to a single ABT. And let me read you my ABT because, and this isn't a super short one, but it's got the basic structure in there. This is what I would like to say to the world, but I'm probably not going to take the time and energy trying to get it out there. But here's the ABT. The Biden administration brought in new pandemic leadership, and if they had matched their powerful science team with an equally good communications team, then the public would have never ended up confused. But that didn't happen, as the White House assembled a team for which only 1 out of 31 experts were from communication, with most of the others being from medicine, 15 MDs, science, 5 PhDs, or public health, 5 MPHs, which meant they lacked the needed expertise. Therefore, next time there needs to be an equal focus on communication and communications experts. Is that not a relatively simple assessment and recommendation for the future, which is what happened? Was the Biden team did pull together their advisory board, first off, with eventually 16 experts, as I say, almost all MDs and PhDs. And then I kept waiting for them to pull together the equal and opposite team of 16 communications people, which if I had some input, I would have said, pick them from the business and the entertainment communities. Those are the people with the specialized skills that know how to connect with the masses, not the academics and the PhDs, and partner these two elements, go for the cerebral for the science and go for the visceral for the communication. And then you'll have the whole thing covered. But in the end, I looked at these two teams. They had first the advisory board of 16 people, and then they morphed that into the White House response team that has 15 people, the total of 31. And then you go through all their credentials. They're on the Wikipedia pages. And lo and behold, only one person who was a low level, 30 or so year old guy that was their one communication strategist. And there just never was that. Now, am I crazy for that being a recommendation? 1 out of 31 is kind of a glaring error, don't we think? Let's go through a few initial thoughts. Park, you follow what I just said there?
No, I totally get it. And think about your audience. Your audience are mostly not scientists. They are the regular world out there that they don't understand 3/4 of the stuff you're talking about, and it's not their fault. They're not meant to. They've got a lot of stuff on their own plates of taking care of kids at home, working virtually, trying to make ends meet. And if you come out and don't speak to them in their own way on their channels to way they can understand what's going on. Again, I'm not talking about speaking down to them. I'm talking about taking these complex messages and simplifying them so that we get focused and we have that singular narrative on what to do next.
Okay, all right. So hang on.
You know what I mean?
You hit on the keyword simple. I'm going to get to that eventually. Okay, next, Doug. Am I crazy? Argue with me with what I just said there, or what do you think?
I can't argue. It goes back to what you say all the time. Narrative is everything, and this is the quintessential example of it. You have the most brilliant minds on the planet solving a global pandemic using science and technology that is beyond the realm of human comprehension, and none of it fucking matters if you can't get the public to understand and buy in to your mission with a clear message. None of it matters. So it just negates all this amazing progress and wonderful human development. I mean, that's a great story that we came up with that vaccine. I know it was years in the making with mRNA and all that, but all that whole decades of work and effort washed away because you can't message it.
There you
So
go.
if you don't have communication, you got nothing.
You got nothing. And Dave, am I wrong with what I had for an ABT there? You want to argue with me, or what do you think?
Not at all. I think you were spot on, but good luck with getting anybody to pay attention to it. As you noted with scientists, those higher up in the world of science are just terrible at communicating. They are matched and in some ways outdone with folks at the higher level of politics. They got elected. Who are you? You didn't get elected. I know how to tell a story. I told a story sufficient to get me elected. So screw you, go away. I know I don't know the latest pixie. I don't have the latest pixie dust on micro-targeting. I'd be happy to invest in that and listen to experts on that. But storytelling, I'm the storyteller. Good luck.
I put one more element in from the legal perspective is what you would not expect, but it happens in that form is it's an adversarial process. You would not expect that there would be these other opposing forces politically motivated that would want to tell a competing narrative simply for their own agenda. And so not only do they have the challenge of simple messaging about what they're doing, but they have the challenge of beating back the opposing messaging. So they need a lot of help with that.
Actually, I mean, so that for starters gets into article on Sunday in the New York Times to that very point about the pandemic. And one of the major experts, epidemiologist at UCLA, and she said, we just have a bad habit of being always reactive, never proactive. I mean, that's it in a nutshell. And that's the problem with the communications. That's what went on exactly with all the anti-vax stuff was there was no proactive thought. It was just all reactive and just on in the moment. Let me read you then what came back from one of these two epidemiologists that I was trying to cultivate the idea of writing something together with them. This individual said very briefly, after reading that ABT and everything went along with it, said, please go ahead, but I'm not in on this as it isn't what I envisioned or what we discussed. It's just not that simple. Park.
And I lost you there. Where did that come from?
That the two epidemiologists I was trying to get to join with me in making a statement about very simple. Next time around, bring in the experts, and the experts are the people from the non-PhDs from business and from entertainment. I mean, they're people like yourself. You know how on a daily basis to work with these folks and communicate. You have the practical skills. But what's going on is this obsession with sophistication, I guess, complexity.
Well, they're locked up in their logic, reasoned brain and think if they can just roll out a bunch of numbers and science, people are going to go, oh, I get it. I'm on board. And people don't get it unless you've got it in the context of a story. And probably their reaction is it's not that simple, is they haven't made the leap from their own complex world into your simple and button, therefore, way of talking about it. There's just a complete disconnect there. And until they really see it in action, it's hard to connect that.
That number that I cited there of their experts that they brought in, out of 31 experts on those two teams, only one was communications. More than half were science and medicine. How does that strike you?
It's not surprising. I mean, when I taught at ASU, the PhDs would all sit there and fold their arms and scoff at me. Oh, you're the soft skills guy. And I love that. And I go, well, and I thought to myself, well, you have no soft skills at all. You can do your algorithms and figure this out, but you can't communicate them to anybody. That's how it strikes me.
And
Park,
all of
by
that.
the way,
Oh yeah, Doug.
They call me the soft skills guy in what I do in the law because of the humanistic element versus the formalized legalistic, bullet point elements, issue, rule, application, conclusion. And I'm talking about the mushy gushy, human story stuff. So they call me the soft
And then
guy in the law.
let's check and make sure that our third expert here is also a soft skills guy. That's basically what you got subjected to, Dave?
Absolutely. I have many a time been dismissed as, you're just a storyteller. You're not a data science guy.
Jeez.
And to that you say, thank God.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so the reason it drives me to the loony bin is because once upon a time I wrote an entire book called Don't Be Such a Scientist. And it got great reviews in Science and Nature. It sold enough copies that the publishers did a second edition in 2018. But the reviewer in Science, Peter Kariva, Chief Science and Nature Conservancy, gave it a nice review, said, great book, but it failed to address the single biggest problem with scientists, which is their inability to listen, which is what's exactly been my journey. Here we are 13 years later since it came out, and no evidence that anybody listened to anything. One of the deeper dimensions that came up last week, I had a long talk with an old evolutionist buddy of mine. So, I was a graduate student starting in 1978 at Harvard University and sat there at the feet of Stephen Jay Gould, the greatest of evolutionists, and was part of his discussion group in his lab and got to know a bunch of his graduate students. And one of them, my good buddy, Rob Dorrit, professor at Smith College now, all these years later, has helped me a bunch over the years. When I got ready to make my Flock of Dodos movie, he and I had one very pivotal phone call where he really filled me in a lot on the dynamic, because that was just the beginning of this anti-evolution movement and he'd already been exposed to it. And because he's as good a communicator just about as Stephen Jay Gould, he's really a great guy, great professor. And we talked about this last week. He's been kind of counseling me a little bit and dealing with this frustration. And one of the things he said was, you need to understand there's probably a really solid red line there that you're not going to get across, which is the fear of the clown show that every scientist deep inside has. They have this fear that they're somehow eventually going to be lured up onto the stage and suddenly be seen as part of the clown show. And as I processed what he said there, I didn't want to believe in the beginning, but it's beginning to reverberate deeper and deeper. It's that credibility thing with scientists that they feel that's the only value they have in life. If they lose their credibility, they're just might as well be put out to pasture. And by asking them to rub shoulders, I think at this broadest of level, my recommendation about bring in the business and entertainment people, that's in their view, bring in the clown show. And then the feeling is then it's all over with. Once we're part of the clown show, nobody's going to listen to us. And so I think that's part of what's going on here is they are desperately wanting to fix this communication problem without bringing in what they feel is the clown show. And the communication problem, it was, just a piece of entertainment for years and years and years as I was trying to address it. And as you say, at Arizona State, when you were there years ago, it was still just light entertainment, like, oh, blah. But the game has changed now. We've had a 2-year pandemic. Close to 1 million people are dead now. Hundreds of thousands, those people went to their death, not understanding what in the world is this thing that I got? Why did I get it? How did I get it? Why couldn't I get cured of it? How should I have been cured? All of this confusion that's gone on over the course of 2 years. And I was on the podcast of Eric Topol, prominent epidemiologist and author at Scripps Research Institute, about 3 weeks ago. And he had in December as one of his guests, Andy Slavitt, who was the head of the White House team, the COVID team, when Biden first came in. He appointed Andy Slavitt as the main guy that got everything going. So he was his guest. And at the end of their 45-minute discussion, Eric put the final question to him, bottom line, how would you assess the job that you guys did? This is part of what shaped my thinking towards this. Was he said, well, I would say, looking back now over the last 2 years, on the science side, I'd give ourselves an A. We did a tremendous job. But on what he called the social science side, and there he is putting the word science with the social dynamics, but really what he's referring to is communication. He said I would give us a D- or an F. And I thought that was wonderful, very blunt and honest. That's what is needed, is calling the stuff out, the failure that it has been. It's all over the headlines. Articles in the New York Times, the Washington Post, all have said the CDC has confused everybody with their job of communication. So it has cost human lives, this poor communication. What was once a source of entertainment is now come down, and it's going to just continue to get worse in the future because science is becoming so important in these things. So I don't know. This is really a good discussion here because all four of us have converged on the same conundrum, which is the analytical types. And what I learned with the CDC in 2010, when my book came out, a group from there brought me in August of 2010 to spend an entire day there, a group from the communication side, not the scientists. The scientists wanted nothing to do with my book, Don't Be Such a Scientist. It was like a traitor basically writing it. But 6 or 7 people from the communication side got in touch with me, and we did a conference call the week before, and they said, we're bringing you in because maybe they'll listen to you, they won't listen to us. You had a tenure professorship, you have a PhD, yada, yada, maybe they'll listen to you. And I got there and I realized, and I listened to the stories that day. And so many of these stories were stories of intimidation. The same thing we're talking about here is the analytical types can get in there and they can flex these massive academic muscles of all their graduate degrees and knowledge and specifics. And the communicators can't keep up with that. And the result is they go quiet. I mean, how do you fight against somebody? This circulates into our principle of the power of storytelling rests in the specifics. These scientists who can get down to all these numbers and concepts you can't even follow. And if they want to flex their muscles and get their way, they can do that. How do you combat that? And the answer is, I guess you don't. And you end up with 1 million people dead, of which a lot of them were communicated to so poorly.
Well, Randy, I'd jump in there too, is not just the messaging, but the strategy behind it. It seems to be so messed up. They're not even thinking of story strategy. For instance, I just got back this morning from my new doctor up here in Flagstaff for my annual physical. And he just happens to say, oh, by the way, do you know you're going to have to start paying for all your COVID tests? And I go, no, I had no idea. I go, what's that about? He goes, I don't know. We just got notes that everyone's going to have to start paying for their own COVID tests. So my first thought is, okay, are we still fighting a pandemic or not? And then number two, I'm going to get my blood work done, right? I said, hey, can you throw a little test in there and just tell me, where am I on my antibodies? Oh, we can't do that here. I go, what do you mean you can't do it here? No, you've got to go to a special place to get antibody tests. Well, and I go, well, that doesn't freaking make any sense. If you're doing all my other tests and you can tell me where my bilirubin is, for God's sake, why can't you just tell me where my antibodies? More confusion. And I asked him, he goes, yeah, they just never made that very easy for us to do, which then a whole anti-story crops up of like, how serious is this thing? And why don't you tell us what's going on? Even the doctors don't appear to know what's going on.
You know what that story makes me want? That story makes me want to pack up and move to Portugal. I mean, has anybody here ever thought about doing that?
There.
Good idea, Randy. And actually, I was about to jump on that. Doug mentioned earlier the idea that there's a competing message that is the anti-vax message that even with all the other problems of storytelling we have here, if you look at an underlying difference between societies in which the vaccination rate is well over 90% fully vaxxed, such as Portugal, and others that have similar kinds of rates, Ireland is another one over 90, and compare them to us, the biggest difference, I believe, is the level of trust in institutions, trust in expertise, in general, not just science expertise, but the dismissal of experts in the US, and it's not just something brandy new. I mean, pointy-headed intellectuals have been the source of disparagement for a long time, and America is a society that does not have the kinds of levels of trust, because to take a vaccine, there is a certain level of trust in science and doctors and recommendations in the society itself. And we don't have that here. And it's much worse now than it used to be, but it's not something that's brandy new.
Do you think that there's any use in trying to combat that, or do you really just think it's done? Well, maybe we shouldn't even get into this with you.
Yeah, you have that conversation with your brother.
My older brother has appointed himself the president of the Nihilist Society, and so yeah, I have those conversations with him. And then Yeah, what is absolutely true is that a hole has been dug very, very deep, and you're not going to get out of it instantly. But the question is, you're never going to get anywhere if you don't start somewhere. And as forbidding as the odds may be, I still enjoy doing this stuff, and I'm going to keep at it because it's fun and interesting. And we're hard at it. I think all three of us, Doug and Park and me. Doug, you got any optimism in dealing with this anti-intellectual nation?
I get why the resistance where the resistance comes from with the people who have devoted their entire life to putting in the work and doing the hard work and coming up with the solutions to the problem and doing this, and they say, well, why do I have to dumb it down and join this clown show? And why do I have to, this is, but it's a problem solution dynamic at work, which is you've done this incredible work, but the public doesn't get it. And if you want your work to mean something, if you want to complete the mission, which is to have everybody buy in, then you better figure out how to message it.
Okay. And so to that very point, what is needed, and who knows if it could happen or not, but what's needed in the science world, at least, is a shift of culture. I mean, it's that broad and deep. And for example, the AAAS, the American Association of Advancement of Science, for years and years and years has had a program there, a committee called the Committee for the Public Understanding of Science and Technology. And that was modeled on the same name in the UK. And think about that name, for the public understanding of science and technology. And there's a mindset that's about science literacy. And there's so much discussion about science. We need to make this a more science literate society. And you will hear discussions with scientists. We need to make it so that people can understand how science is done and all of that sort of stuff. And I've come around to the belief that no, you don't. The public doesn't need to understand science. Science needs to understand the public. There's the fundamental divide there. There's the conceptual, cultural divide, which is that science has got this culture of you public people need to raise your game up to our level and understand this is how science works. And we deal with uncertainty on a daily basis, yada, yada, yada. My answer to that is when you read Robert McKee's book Story, in the second chapter, you read about these characteristics of story that go back 4,000 years to Gilgamesh. And in those 8 characteristics he lays out there are these simple elements of the singular narrative. The public has had thousands of years of evolving their brain around this mode of communication. And you science people need to get down there and understand this is how they communicate, instead of just telling them to rise to your level. And I think that's where we get to this clown show thing, which is, well, that's just going down to join the clown show with them and giving up on everything. But it's not, and I think that's going to be the agenda of, mark my words, this narrative gym thing we're going to start the beginning of May we're going to grow it into something. It is the logical transition. Let's hear a few thoughts on that. This is kind of our final little segment here for what we're discussing here. I laid it out at the beginning. Park, I gave it to you yesterday. You seem to understand it immediately. What do you think about this weekly 1-hour narrative gym session of anywhere from 200 to 300 to 400 people all viewing a session of operating on somebody's narrative?
I think it makes a lot of sense. And before you get into that, the one last thing from a branding standpoint of what you just said, Randy, is I would tell every scientist out there is stop selling me on the science. Sell me on the outcomes. What am I going to get out of this? What is in it for me? I don't care what you make. I care about what you make happen in my life. And that's where the story comes in. And I think that's what this new program that you've got, the Narrative Gym, is. This is a thing that you just got to keep working over and over. We say that time and time again. I call the ABT the storytelling dumbbell, because you literally have to curl it every day. Practice it in your emails, practice it in all of your writing. Even you're sitting down across the table having lunch with someone, be thinking in ABT format, because it doesn't come to you naturally. It just takes practice. But after 30 or so days of really dedicated practice to it, you build what we all often talk about is that narrative intuition. You just start thinking that way, listening that way. And you said one thing earlier too in the show. The ABT, I have found, is a remarkable listening tool. And if you say scientists aren't listening, just like salespeople don't listen, just like customers don't listen, when you are sitting there and somebody is downloading their problem on you, when you get good at the ABT, you can filter through it and then repeat back what they said in an ABT format, and it blows them away. They'll say, wow, you said that way better than I did. You actually understand what I'm talking about.
By the way, that's what you do that on a daily basis, don't you?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And then the final thing they say is, my God, you said that so clearly, I forgot to tell you one other thing.
Yeah.
And that one other thing is always the real problem you're dealing with. So
give us a couple words
on this new narrative gym you're doing. I'm all for it because it just simply takes practice.
Yeah. Well, you're going to be one of the featured players from the very beginning. So better start getting warmed up.
I've got an ABT for you for that. The ABT is short and sweet, but tricky. Therefore, practice.
Perfect. And just 2 sentences about how you do on a daily basis. This is what you do. You have people download their whole company's practice to you, and you spit back the ABT.
Yeah. I mean, with big groups, the Home Depot, I work with their internal sales teams. The U.S. Air Force, I work with brigadier to 4-star generals out of Washington, D.C., to one-off entrepreneurs out of Melbourne, Australia. And what I'm always getting is they give me their download, and I'll go and rebuild like a landing page to demonstrate the ABT in action, or a sales presentation. And they will go and actually swipe my ABTs and put them to use and come back. We had one customer from Upwork, I'll tell you that, who they are. I won't tell you who they sold to, said they used the ABT in a presentation to a major tech company, which led to 2 major pieces of business coming out of this high tech firm. That Upwork then said they equated that using the ABT to a revenue increase of $150,000 to $200,000 on those 2 sales right there. So now you cannot just have an anecdotal stories around how powerful the ABT is. You can actually apply real ROI to it.
There you go. Doug, same sort of thing.
I just want to make sure I'm unmuted. I am. Yeah. No. Here's my hopeful note for the rest of today. I think that to the extent that there's resistance in these various silos, that the proof is in the pudding. And so the ABT, the narrative gym, it's going to get people, seeing this in action. They're going to take it out into the world. And once they have,
give me your first impression on. You heard me run through the concept at the beginning.
Yeah, I love it.
Makes sense to you?
It makes great sense to me. I'll be tuning in. It sounds like chaos, but I love it. With that many people in there. But I'm sure you're gonna keep everybody in line. But what you're doing is there will be a tipping point. I guarantee you, especially in the science community, where all this reluctance will be overcome as soon as you have a few people putting this into practice and hitting home runs in the communication field, and all of a sudden people go, well, I guess this is the way we need to do it. It's not gonna happen overnight. It's gonna be slowly but surely. I guarantee it.
And how important do you think simplicity is in all this?
It's everything. It's everything. I mean, from my own perspective and what I do in the law, because it's the same as the science, and it's the same as the wonky Democrat policy, bullet point, data-driven people. We are just full on like swimming in facts, and we don't know how to make it simple and powerful. And until we can get that going, we can't win. We can't do our jobs. Period.
Yeah, exactly. Dave, were you able to follow my description there at the beginning of this concept we're going to launch at the beginning of May, which, by the way, this will be something you can, for people you've tried to explain the ABT to, they can for free just go listen in every Wednesday at 11, and they'll hear it live, two half-hour sessions of all the people trained in this thing working with the people to strengthen their ABTs. Is that making sense to you, Dave?
It makes good sense. And I applaud the persistence and to fight a good fight, whatever the theater is that you're doing. And as an additional point, picking up, Doug mentioned the tipping point. And this was from a trial lawyer I heard once, explaining how much information you can give to a jury. I'd be curious to get Doug's reaction to this. He said, it's like you're pouring liquid into a cup that can tilt if you pour in too much. And if you pour in too much information to the jury, it'll tilt and there's nothing left in it. And it's as though you haven't told them anything at all. It's like in direct mail fundraising, a discipline I started in many decades ago. If you underline everything in a letter, if you highlight everything in a letter, it's as though you've underlined or highlighted nothing. It's that winnowing down, that simplicity, that focus that allows people to absorb what you're trying to communicate to them.
Doug, thoughts on that?
If it doesn't fit, you must acquit. Because I'm sure the closing arguments in that trial went for 3, 4, 5 days, but that's about the only thing anybody's ever going to take away from it. You know, I used to have a heart attack when I was a baby lawyer, and the judge said, "You have 30 minutes for your closing argument, counsel." And I'm like, "But I have 2 hours of material here." And, you know, if the judge was being honest with me, they'd say, "Hey, dummy, that's not the way you do this. Get it done in 30 minutes, right?" So I 100% agree. You know, when I worked with a lawyer, it was a real quick story, but it was a death penalty case. And it had gone on for 2 months, this trial. And I read her closing argument, and it was brilliant. And it went through methodically, point by point, of everything we heard from every single witness called. And I said, dude, if they don't know this shit by now, they're never going to know it. They've spent 2 months listening to 100 witnesses. Don't tell them what you want them to know. What do you want them to feel? And focus on that.
And you know what? I'll match that with Dave. This is an anecdote that Carville had told me about. He had said, you know, it happens to him over and over again. He gets hired by these big corporations, international corporations, and they bring him in for communications, and they give him 30 volumes of all of their annual reports and everything else like that. And then they say, you know, take this and boil it down for us. And he said, I come back with like a paragraph or 2 paragraphs. And they say, okay, this is a good start. And then he says, no, this is the whole thing. And they say, we're going to pay you all this money. You know, where's the rest of it? And he said, that's it. That's all that you need. And the problem is that, you know, it takes a brilliant mind to be able to do that. And then these people have a hard time matching that up. And I asked you about Ann Richards and her narrative intuition. Is it not the same case for Carville? Don't you think he's just got this really deep ability to digest that complexity down to simplicity? Your thoughts on him over the years, Dave?
Oh, absolutely. He too is a great storyteller. He's fun to listen to, but he also gets to strip down all the rhetoric, strip down all the bullet points, and come up with something simple, compelling, emotional. That is a way to persuade people to change their behavior, whether it's how they are going to judge a case on a jury, or whether or not they're going to buy a product, or how they're going to vote. If you don't change people's behavior with your communication, then you're just wasting your time and effort, and getting people to change their behavior isn't easy. Being compelling, emotional, powerful is the only chance you have to do that.
You know,
but so many people refuse to listen because they have 50 more bullet points they want to end.
That's the truth.
By the way, how long ago was It's the Economy, stupid? Because I still remember that, and I was probably in my teens when that happened.
It's getting to be 30 years exactly.
Yep.
And these 2 clips I use in the course now, which is 2 months ago, Carville on Meet the Press, in which the host asked him, you know, what should the Democratic Party do this year for their campaign? And he just sat there, composed himself, and said 5 words: gloat, you gloat, and you promote. And then he took a moment and then elaborated on what I mean by exactly that. But he had that little catchphrase right there that boiled everything down. You could walk away with what it's all about. And he knew instinctively to lead with the attention grabber, then fill in all the details. And then the clip I show is of Rochelle Walensky wonderful scientist, head of the Centers for Disease Control on Colbert a couple months ago, right about the same time. And he said to her, "What's up with the vaccines?" And she dove into all these, well, the vaccines are doing this, that, and we find their effectiveness, this. And she got to the end of all this science that had lost the whole audience. And then last thing she says, vaccines work. That should have been the opening. You begin with the headline and then you get in the details and you give us the simple little thing we could take away with up front, instead of forcing us to sit there and follow all this information. The intuition is so reverse between these two worlds of science and the humanities. And it's got to change. That's what it is. This is not a time to say, well, that'll never change. Either it changes, or this anti-science movement that is now stampeding with Robert Kennedy Jr. of all the bizarre ironies, a Kennedy leading the attack on the entire biomedical community as they're just hoping it'll go away. It ain't going away. It's all based on communication. And the time is coming to either do something, or I don't know what the future holds.
Well, Randy, with these 4 books, what do our 4 worlds have in common? Yours, the science academic world, mine, the business, Doug, the law world, Dave, the political world. What do we all have in common? Is that nobody buys boring. Doesn't matter what you're selling. If you're trying to get someone off or mitigate their sentence, if you bore them to death, they're not going to buy into them. If you're trying to get someone elected, they're not going to buy boring. And if the Democrats want to lean on their 50-point position papers, that's boring as shit. Especially in my world, nobody buys boring. So my ABT for that is to anybody listening. And if you feel like you could really use Randy's course, think of it this way. You communicate and care, but probably bore. Therefore, tell a story to arouse and fulfill and excite your audience to action.
And my final lesson for the audience is, if you want to know how to end a podcast effectively, bring on as one of your guests a podcast host who knows how to wrap everything together with a final statement of nobody buys boring. Thank you very much, Park. That is the perfect grand summary for all that we've been through. And I want to thank all of you guys for your efforts working with me on the books. And they were all breeze, all 3 of them. Really, really fun to write. All came together quickly. All of you guys took it on with just the right level of detail, not getting carried away like, well, this needs to be 200 pages. No, it was a tough challenge I gave each of you. We've got to keep this thing short. Here's your number of words. And all 3 of you have already got that, pre-programming to know how. You've got the narrative intuition to boil down all the stuff.
Hey, Randy, I've got to push back on one thing you said at the beginning of the show. Is that you wrote a marvelous narrative, Jim. And yes, I was the first one to raise my hand and said, we need to bring it to business. And you said, we rewrote the 1st chapter and the 7th chapter. That's not entirely true, because you worked really hard with each one of us to go in through all those internal chapters to make sure that they were making sense to the business world, to the lawyer world, to the political world. So I think you're giving yourself short shrift on really how powerful each of these books are for their respective industries.
And I must say, I've had one burning question this whole time. When you held up these 4 versions, I feel like the politics one is bigger and thicker than all the rest. And I don't want to seem like I have an inferiority complex or anything, but did I hallucinate that? And if so, what's going on there? Is that bigger?
No, it's in a larger font size for the older crowd, maybe.
Really? All right.
No, we cheated.
All right. All right.
What, you going to bring in your legal team?
I just know when I was writing my thing, Randy's like, this is really good, but chop 6,000 words out of it.
That's our sensitivity coach right there. We get that all the time from him.
Yeah.
I will pull together the numbers and show.
I just want to make sure we all got equal.
They are not statistically significantly different. Right. They're all within the same bounds. And the cool thing is that I guarantee you we're still just getting started on these 4 books, because it's going to be in this narrative gym embodiment exercise that we're going to get started. And I'm doing it for a long time to come, because I have so much fun with it. And the idea of this is only 1 hour a week, this is not like a, complicated thing. One of the things we've learned with the course is we've done 24 rounds of the course with it being twice a week. And suddenly we did one with East Carolina University. We only meet once a week. and the attendance has been unbelievable. Tomorrow will be their final 10th session, and every session, 30 out of 30 professors have all been there because it's only gone once a week. We've learned something from that. Trying to do something twice a week actually instantly it's kind of like the singular narrative thing. It's the Nicholas Kristof deal. As soon as you go from 1 to 2, everything starts to glom up. I'm just thinking of this right this moment in the Nicholas Kristof article in Outside Magazine. He gets into the social science research of Paul Slovic from University of Oregon about this idea. As soon as you go from 1 to 2, the whole world changes. And why then in the world would you put together a spokes team for the pandemic from the White House that goes on television with 3 people on there, with the CDC director and the NIH guy, Fauci, and the White House guy, Zients? And that's what they did from the beginning. That's just a monument to their failure to grasp basic communication dynamics narrative. As soon as you go from the 1 to the 2, you've already glommed things up. And that's why we're going to do this thing once a week. It's only going to be every Wednesday morning. We're going to have so much fun with it. And I will be seeing all of you guys on that. And on that note, thank you all very, very much for this episode of the podcast. And
thank you.
Talk to you all soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys.